and I did read your mission statement online, and I think it's like an amazing statement that you're dedicated to prevent, end, and seek retribution for all forms of mass murder against ethnic and religious groups. So tonight, I'd like to share some of my own understanding of genocide, and then I will talk about my grandfather, David Ohanessian's life and his art, our family's experience of the Armenian genocide, and then end by taking a very brief look at how some elements of Armenian cultural destruction are continuing even today. And after that, I'll look forward to a conversation or answering questions, asking questions. As you know, April 24th is the solemn day on which Armenians remember a period of mass violence, forced displacement, and appropriation initiated by the Ottoman Young Turk government in 1915 under the cover of World War I, in which most of the Ottoman Empire's more than 2 million Armenians were massacred, expelled, conscripted into labor gangs, abducted, tortured, or left to die of hunger and disease during months-long marches or in concentration camps in the Syrian desert. Of course, it wouldn't be until 1943-44 that the word genocide was coined by the Polish Jewish jurist Raphael Lemkin. Prior to Lemkin's neologism, Armenians used a variety of terms. They would say ahed, or catastrophe, medzierern, great crime, Holocaust. In my family, I most often heard the terms massacres, abductions, forced marches, because my parents and grandparents used terms that reflected their own lived experiences. But Lemkin, as a legal theorist, spent decades thinking about the acts and the language. So for him, the initial conceptualization of what he called offenses against the law of nations included two categories: acts of barbarity and acts of vandalism. And by this, he meant the systematic destruction of works of cultural heritage. The former, acts of barbarity, for him in his first conceptualizations included trade in slaves, trade in women and children, attacks carried out against an individual as a member of a collectivity, with the goal being not only to harm that individual, but also to cause damage to the entire collectivity to which that individual belongs. So Lemkin's work and his great concern with finding fitting legal terms ultimately led to the United Nations ratified 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And Sonya is going to put the link to that entire document in the chat box right now, so you have access to it.
It's
Lemkin,
already in there.
Okay, very good, thank you. So Lemkin had been inspired from as early as the 1920s to pursue this work in part as a response to the treatment of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, by the Nazi attempts to exterminate Europe's Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and other stigmatized groups. He himself lost nearly 50 family members in the Holocaust. So Armenians have adopted this legal term, genocide, Armenian genocide, which encompasses this full catalog of horrors that our ancestors either endured or did not survive. And we are all waiting for the presidential statement on Saturday, in which we hope President Biden will follow the course of both houses of Congress in 2019 and formally, officially recognize the Armenian genocide. I'm going to come back to some of these themes a bit later, but in keeping with the spirit of your club, I'd also like to underline your cause and urge all of us not to let up in our attention on the many catastrophic abuses that are going on in the world right now. These tend to fall out of the news cycle, so it's up to us to keep looking. China's treatment of the Uyghurs, the mostly Muslim Turkic minority in the northwest region of Xinjiang, the Rohingya, another predominantly Muslim group driven out of Myanmar. Many of the Rohingya have fled to Bangladesh. There's also, of course, the huge humanitarian crisis in Yemen, where according to UNICEF, some 4.4 million Yemenis are internally displaced, and that includes 1.7 million children. Another catastrophe that we rarely hear about anymore, the mass kidnappings of school children in Nigeria, but these are happening on a regular basis. Here in the US, we're perhaps only beginning to reckon with atrocities in our own past that as we know very well, continue to resonate today. Yesterday was a big day. As one example of these past atrocities, a lot of Americans had their first exposure to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre through a couple of TV shows over the last 2 years, the Lovecraft Country and HBO's Watchmen. And I hope that in the coming weeks, as we approach the 100th commemoration of this race massacre, this catastrophic series of events, that we'll all be learning more about this historic assault that took place on American soil over May 31st to June 1st, 1921, on Tulsa's, Oklahoma's African-American Greenwood district, in which violent white mobs, some of them deputized and armed by the local police, looted shops, set homes on fire using torches and oil-soaked rags, shot fellow US citizens in cold blood, and dropped turpentine bombs from low-flying airplanes on roughly 10,000 Black residents of Greenwood. A lot of this, I think, resonates with Armenian descendants of genocide survivors, since there are parallels here, but I think it's something that all Americans should know more about. And there's the copy of the Oklahoma Commission report, which is actually very, very readable. And there are a number of articles by various scholars, sociologists that shed light on this. So returning to our legal definition of genocide, the American sociologist Irving L. Horowitz built on some of Lemkin's theories and argued in his 1980 book, Taking Lives, Genocide and State Power, that genocide is a structural and systematic destruction of innocent people by a state bureaucratic apparatus. So for Americans, for Armenians, for others, it's up to us to hold both past and the present injustices in our minds, which is a supreme challenge, but your group's mission actually gives me a lot of hope. So I'd like to turn to the story of my maternal grandfather now, David Ohanessian, a ceramicist who left his enduring mark on the face of Jerusalem. Feast of Ashes is his biography, and it's the product of 10 years of research and travel in search of his works. These are my grandparents. In the years before World War I, Ohanessian was a renowned master of the historic Ottoman Kütahya ceramics tradition. In early 1916, during the period of the Armenian Genocide, he, my grandmother, and their 3 small children were deported from Kütahya towards Syria. After surviving 3 awful years as a refugee in Aleppo and Meskene, the Ohanessians resettled in 1918 in Jerusalem, where my grandfather reestablished his art. So because he's an artist and the founder, he's the acknowledged founder of this very distinctive part of Jerusalem's visual culture, I just wanted to share a few slides of his work to begin with to acquaint you with it in case you're not familiar. So in addition to this kind of monumental tile installation that you see here, his Kütahya and his Jerusalem workshops also produced pottery, which was distinguished by intense saturated colors, a mix of opaque and translucent glazes. And over 30 years of creating ceramics in Jerusalem, he really tied this art, tied this tradition to the city, this Armenian art, selling ceramics to tourists and pilgrims. He exhibited in international expositions, received numerous commissions for monumental tile works, and he built this broad export network. So today you can find his work in homes and museums all over the world. For those of you who've been to Jerusalem, if you've walked around the old city, you will undoubtedly have seen these lovely Armenian shops featuring beautiful, colorful glazed pottery and tiles. And actually at this point in time, Armenian ceramics constitute a significant economic activity, a significant part of the economic output of Jerusalem Armenians today. If you walk around outside the old city, if you look up especially, you'll see these beautiful blue, green, white tiles splashing color against Jerusalem's gold building stones. And once you start looking around for them, you'll see them in many, many different places. In fact, they're so kind of well integrated into the cityscape that international film and art directors use them as a kind of visual shorthand for Jerusalem. Here's a press conference at the luxurious American Colony Hotel where the photographer has seated these two writers in front of Ohanessian ceramics. And in 2003, the Israeli Postal Service celebrated Armenian ceramics with a series of stamps. Going back a little bit in time, 1986, the Arets Museum in Tel Aviv organized the first formal museum exhibition of the Armenian pottery of Jerusalem. And the curator recognized it as a distinct art, a separate branch in the larger field of Ottoman ceramics. This exhibition catalog and the subsequent scholarly art historical writings recognized that Ohanessian's career bridged two schools of ceramic making, this centuries-old Anatolian Kütahya tradition that he had mastered before the First World War, and then this Jerusalem art. Everyone acknowledged that the former was the inspiration for the latter. And each of these arts had been surveyed by specialist art historians, but this gap remained. Nobody could explain, how did the art get from Anatolia to Palestine? I understood as his granddaughter that the answer to that was directly tied to my grandfather's arrest and deportation from Kütahya during the Armenian Genocide, but this was a subject that no art historian or anyone else seemed to want to discuss. So although parts of his story had been told, almost everything that was written about him contained significant errors aside from those gaps. And especially I found in the writings of British historians, he was often portrayed, as the colonial mindset. He was often portrayed as this like voiceless, powerless artisan dependent on British mandate patrons. And although I never met him because he died before I was born, I knew that he was a person of great drive and agency, intelligence, expertise. So in researching and writing Feast of Ashes, I wanted to draw a much clearer line from the first half of his career to the second and memorialize his deportation from Kütahya to Aleppo to Jerusalem. So let's just take a quick look at his early years in Kütahya and the circumstances of the artistic tradition there. But first, let's just look at a map. So here's the Ottoman Empire, just to ground us in the region of the world that we're talking about. So here's a map of the Ottoman Empire in colors. The colors sections illustrate the greatest expanse. And then in the middle, you see kind of messy red outline. So the red outline circles the Anatolian Peninsula. That's most of the contemporary Republic of Turkey. That's what exists from this once, huge Ottoman Empire. And a lot of these expansions that you see in these colored regions were due to the conquest of the most familiar of the Ottoman sultans, Suleiman the Magnificent, who also plays an important role in Ottoman ceramics. From the time of the Ottoman Empire's founding around the year 1299, it expanded east through conquest, conquering some of these eastern highlands that were historically populated with Armenians. So these are the ancient historic Armenian homelands. So we see shaded in pink, this is around the year 1900, these 6 eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire, which are also often referred to as the Armenian provinces. Lots of Kurdish people live there as well. And then over on the other side of the Russian border here, you see this province of Yerevan, as it was known then, which is most of what constitutes modern Armenia today with its capital city of Yerevan. So my grandfather was born in 1884 in the village of Muradja in Western Anatolia, where he spent most of his life. And in Western Anatolia. And our family, our clan, our Gerdastan, as we call it, maintained a very strong tradition of storytelling. And so all the details about generations and marriages, professions, all of these things were passed down generation after generation, telling stories around the hearth on cold winter nights. And in this way, he learned that he was in part descended from other ceramicists, people who had traveled to this historic Ottoman ceramic center of Kütahya to learn this art. And similarly, my mother, as a child in Palestine, also learned all the histories of her ancestors. And so in the very last years of her life, she transcribed them. She made copies for every member of my generation. And from this account, I learned that in 1902, Ohanessian at the age of 17, followed in the footsteps of his ancestors, moved to Kütahya, and pursued an apprenticeship at a ceramics studio. By 1907, he'd mastered the art. He opened his own studio. Here is his letterhead. Just a year later, the 1908 Young Turk Revolution overturned the old Ottoman dynastic rule. And for a very brief moment, it inspired great optimism, especially among its minority populations, including the Armenians, the Greeks, the Jews, and other minority groups. The Young Turks had this, they put forward this idea of liberty, equality, fraternity. And you see these terms taken from, of course, the French Revolution, written here, celebrated here in Armenian in this Kütahya plate. So this new Young Turk government, in this brief moment of optimism, engaged in a lot of modernizing projects, and they wanted to address the accumulated damage to the great historic monuments. This is damage that had built up over the course of the 19th century when the old government had declared bankruptcy, lost territories, and was contending with these huge demographic shifts. So in this period, 1908, all three Kütahya studios, Ohanessian's, the Minasyan brothers studio, and the studio of Mehmet Emin, worked with the government's leading architect, Mimar Kemalettin, and they engaged in a lot of renovation work. And during this period, Ohanessian gained wide expertise and achieved renown for his skill in historic renovation. So at the same time, these Kütahya studios were producing new tile work. There was a new architectural style that emerged in this moment called the Ottoman Revivalist style in that period. And today it's called the First National style. It's this very romantic, retrospective style. And because there was this resurgence of tile making, the architects involved incorporated a lot of tile embellishments. And as you walk around Istanbul today, you see these Kütahya tiles, beautiful tiles on boat landings, even though nobody really knows where they come from. You see them on this small mosque behind the main post office in Sirkaci. And quite extraordinarily, you see them decorating the entire spectacular interior of the penultimate Ottoman Sultan, Reshad V. So this is my grandfather's work and the work of the other two studios of that day. But in October of 1911, Ohanessian would meet somebody who would change the course of his life, a British member of parliament, Mark Sykes, whom I'm sure many of you know better, thanks to his infamous 1916 Sykes-Picot Treaty. Sykes traveled to Istanbul on a diplomatic mission, and while he was there, he made a detour to Kütahya looking for a ceramicist. A few months earlier, his family manor in Yorkshire called Slebnere House had burned to the ground. And as Sykes rebuilt it, he wanted to add a completely tiled room in this so-called Oriental style, and he gave Ohanessian the commission. So after the tiles were installed in early 1914, lots of visitors came by, people from Sir Mark's aristocratic social circle, the British Foreign Office, high British military officials. They came, they admired Ohanessian's work, and chief among these visitors was Sykes's very good friend, Ronald Storrs. We'll hear more about him in just a second. So, this was like a very optimistic but short-lived moment in Kütahya, which faded with the Ottoman entry into war in 1914, November. In January of 1915, the Ottoman Third Army suffered a huge loss in the Battle of Sarıkamış. And within weeks, the government began rounding up and massacring and exiling Armenians in the provinces. On the evening of April 24th, 1915, the Young Turk regime arrested more than 200 Armenian luminaries in Constantinople, exiled them to the interior. Most of them were murdered later. In December of 1915, Ohanessian himself was arrested. He was falsely accused of engaging in revolutionary activity. This was like a very typical pretense for arresting, anybody Armenian. And he and his wife and their 3 young children were deported on a rail car, much like this. Like other Armenians from the Western provinces, they followed the rail line to the end in Bozanti. You see Bozanti here, here's Kütahya. So, the Ottomans had built this much of the train line, but it certainly was not complete throughout the empire. So at the end of the train line, the Armenians were put off these stock cars and led on these forced marches through the Taurus and Amanus Mountains toward the Arab provinces. Now, these photos obviously don't depict my family, but they do depict circumstances that are very similar to what my grandparents described to their children. And it was bleak. I mean, people would hire animals as long as they had money, but they were often robbed, attacked. So even being able to hire a cart for a brief period of time was a sign that people were probably toward the beginning of their deportation journey. Nobody knew how long it would last. Nobody really knew what was going to come ahead. And people became destitute very, very quickly. During this long march, my grandfather contracted a serious case of typhus. He almost died, but the family did reach Aleppo later in 1916. In December of 1917, the British conquered Jerusalem, bringing to an end 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. Ronald Storrs was installed as the new military governor of Jerusalem, and he faced a lot of very severe problems, including starvation among the residents of Jerusalem. Many people died of starvation and disease, as well as thousands of new arriving refugees, many of whom were orphans. So in addition to these human catastrophes that were taking place in Jerusalem, the British also were very interested in restoring Jerusalem's major holy sites, including and especially the Dome of the Rock. So Suleiman the Magnificent had covered it with ceramic tiles in the 16th century. By the end of the Great War, the tiles were in really precarious condition. Like other tiled monuments, it required regular attention. It hadn't received that attention since the end of the 19th century. And Palestine's parched landscape lacked the clays and other minerals necessary to match the original work. So what happened was, in the centuries following Suleiman's tiling, people would come to Jerusalem carrying, clay, other minerals. They would produce new tiles, put them on, and then they would go to their home regions. By 1918, Governor Storrs was inviting other British experts to come and survey these monuments and figure out a plan. And people were wondering if it would even be possible to continue making glazed tiles. The British had no idea where to turn, what to do. Charles Ashby, who is a well-known figure in British arts and crafts, who was brought there by Governor Storrs, asked the same question. I mean, he was very much in favor of establishing a tile workshop in Jerusalem, but nobody knew how this could be done. So they started sending messages out. And meanwhile, in November of 1918, Mark Sykes came through Jerusalem on his final British Foreign Office mission. He saw the precarious condition of the tiles on the Dome of the Rock. 2 weeks later, he arrived in Aleppo. And one of his tasks there was to interview Armenian survivors, interview the refugees, report on their condition to the British government. And during this very short period of days, he re-encountered my grandfather. I mean, it was kind of a miracle of fate. He immediately connected him with Ronald Storrs in Jerusalem. Of course, all these other British officials had seen Ohanessian's work in Sykes's Sledmere house, and they all recommended him. So the Ohanessians arrived in Palestine from Syria at the end of 1918, and my grandfather began a series of experiments, testing the local clays, woods. He realized pretty quickly that he was not going to find what he needed, so he requested safe passage to return to Kütahya to get what he needed to begin tile making. Here you see a photo that I found in the archive of the Armenian Genocide Museum in Yerevan, which shows my grandfather in the background on the right. And these young men, boys who are in front of him working on the wheel are, again, orphans. He's teaching them how to make ceramics. So Ohanessian goes to Kütahya, gets the material, and when he comes back, he also brings with him the remaining surviving Armenian ceramicists of Kütahya. And he establishes a new studio on the Via Dolorosa called the Dome of the Rock Tiles. He cooperated with the Near East Relief, the American philanthropic effort. and with the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem, and both of them placed orphans with him as apprentices to learn this art. So here's a well-known Jerusalem image. This is very much reproduced. You can buy a mounted version of it in many souvenir shops in Jerusalem. And here's an argument for why it's so important to preserve family stories and why I encourage all of you who have any interest in doing it to do it as well. So what we think we see are this group of girls, young women, serenely painting ceramics. But what's not really well known at all is that most of these children were orphaned in the Armenian Genocide. Some of them had witnessed their entire families dying or murdered. They were placed with Ohanessian in order to learn a trade. A number of them really took to the art and remained with him to the end, till 1948. But some well-known art historians, primarily British ones, who've been very, very dismissive of this early period of Jerusalem ceramics, didn't recognize that these, and here's a sample of one, that these kind of loosely painted but brilliantly glazed pieces were actually the products of these orphaned children who were striving to learn a craft, in conditions of poverty and hunger and just unthinkable loss. So Ohanessian had this task before him, a large task, which was not only to teach people how to make ceramics, to find the materials, to divide the labor, but also to find markets so that he could sell them, because this needed to be a self-sustaining enterprise. So he used all of his marketing skills that he had developed during the years in Kütahya to rebuild export channels, promote his products. And the Pro-Jerusalem Society that the British set up gave him a number of important commissions. One of them was to produce street name tiles for the old city that you see here. Another commission was to produce a faience model of the Dome of the Rock as a wedding present for the British Princess Mary. She got married in 1922, I believe. Also in 1922, Balian and Karakashian left Ohanessian's employ. They founded their own joint studio outside the old city on Nablus Road. And this would become Palestine's second Armenian ceramics workshop. So here we see my family, 1923, one of many families in Jerusalem, struggling to regain any kind of sense of normalcy, prosperity. We see my future Aunt Sararpi in the center holding a Bible, which means that, this is a statement of what the family wanted to project about themselves. And at the same time, many other Palestinian families that had been hit hard by the war, devastated by the war, were rebuilding themselves. And as they became more prosperous, they hired local architects to design villas and apartment buildings. And in the 1920s and 30s, Ohanessian carried over to Jerusalem this Ottoman tradition that we saw a little bit earlier of exterior architectural tile embellishment. Under the British mandatory government, all new construction in Jerusalem was required to be built of the local limestone. And the only exception to this were these colorful tiled embellishments. So you would see this beautiful gold, reddish, white gold stone, and the only color that stands out against them are these beautiful blue tiles. And many of them are in place today. Another change is that once Ohanessian was in Jerusalem, he felt freer to use Christian iconography, something that he didn't really do in Anatolia. Sometimes he took inspiration from medieval Armenian illuminations. And over time, he did rebuild this export network. He distributed through a lot of international outlets, including Liberties of London. He exhibited in international expositions, including the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, the Century of Progress World's Fair. And he received massive commissions from British Mandate architects as well in the Middle East, in Europe, in the United States, and many of these works remain in place. So in Jerusalem, he rigorously tried to preserve the historic Anatolian ceramic making techniques, in spite of the fact that Palestine didn't have the specific clays and minerals that characterized that old tradition. Among the big commissions that he received from British Mandate Architects was a tiled niche, to make a tiled niche for a new museum funded by John D. Rockefeller and intended to display the Holy Land's antiquities, this Palestine Archaeological Museum. So here we see the niche from the courtyard. Here we step inside to the niche. It's quite magnificent. It opened in 1938 to the public. Here's a close-up, which you also see on the cover of the book. So for me, probably his most personal creation in Jerusalem was this now badly damaged memorial altar created in 1928 as a donation for the Armenian convent of Saint Savior. And it bears a dedication tile made by my grandfather 10 years after he'd first arrived in Palestine as a refugee. And the tile reads, Tavit Ohanessian of Kütahya in the year of the Lord, 1919, established the art of ceramics in Jerusalem, and in his workshop prepared the tiles of this holy altar dedicated at the gate of St. Savior Monastery in memory of his parents and all the deceased in the year of the Lord, 1928. By 1944, the Palestine Post was celebrating the 25th anniversary of this tradition, and it characterized Ohanessian as an artist of the old type, worthy of a tradition he has carried over to our days. He continued to produce pottery and tiles in his workshop on the Via Dolorosa until the beginning of 1948. One by one, the family fled Jerusalem's violence, the bombings, sniper fire. They scattered to England, Soviet Armenia in 1947, Damascus, Cairo, and then Beirut, where my grandfather died in 1953. The joint Balian Karakashian workshop continued operating until the deaths of the original partners. Their descendants opened separate workshops, and in 1954, Nishan Balian's son married Marie Alexandrian. So she was a French-Armenian painter trained in Lyon, and when she married into the Balian family, she introduced a completely new design vocabulary to Jerusalem tile work, and she was recognized in 1992 by the Smithsonian Institution, which gave her a solo show. The Karakashian family continues to operate their pottery studio on Greek Orthodox Patriarchate Street in Jerusalem. It's a wonderful place to visit. And we have the Sandruni brothers, Garo, George, and Harry, with their shops, their 3 separate shops. Vic Lepedjian is making ceramics just a few steps from the entrance of the Armenian St. James complex. And there's Hagop Antriasian. We see him at work in his shop on Zion Street in the Armenian quarter. So in a remarkable kind of recent development, this new branch of Kütahya style Armenian ceramics is now taking root in Gyumri, Armenia's 2nd largest city, which for a long time struggled to recover from a devastating earthquake in 1988, in which more than 50,000 Armenians died, 100,000 people were injured. And in Gyumri, a new generation of young Armenians is learning the art, entering the profession. So I would urge you to please consider, if you have a special occasion, buy some Gyumri ceramics. It's this wonderful, long train of Armenian cultural heritage. Today, Gyumri is also where a large number of refugees from the violence in Artsakh are taking shelter. So this war waged by Azerbaijan on Armenian Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh beginning last September was not only a humanitarian disaster with high Armenian casualties, thousands of displaced refugees, and the continuing threat of cultural destruction, in spite of the armistice agreement negotiated with the intervention of Russia, Azerbaijan has not returned captured Armenian soldiers and civilians. And so there's evidence that some have even been killed after the treaty. Some of you may also be familiar with the Azeri destruction of thousands of Armenian Nakhichevans, this magnificent necropolis, these medieval khachkars, carved stone crosses that were massively destroyed in 2005. You're going to get a couple of links there now. And there's evidence that this destruction is going on even until today. Here is a 7th century Armenian church, one monument that may be at risk. Archaeologist Lori Khachaturian of Cornell University is monitoring this through Caucasus Heritage Watch. And the other day she posted these dual images, which seem to indicate that there's destruction underway. So here I would actually ask anybody who feels so inclined to join in and make some phone calls. We have this list for you. We're going to send you the link. We're asking for 3 different acts. First, most important is to free the Armenian prisoners of war. That's just number 1. They should be released because they include civilians as well, and they should be released immediately. It would be very helpful if you call your local representative. Also ask your representative to support aid to Armenia and Artsakh if you feel so inclined. And then anybody who wants to, please call the White House switchboard, the comments line, and urge President Biden to fully and formally recognize the Armenian genocide. Signs are that he will, but you know, it does not at all hurt to have people jump on and make the case. So to close, I hope that we've seen that Armenian ceramics, which are such a characteristic art of Jerusalem and now also Gyumri, they're not static story. They are not simply beautiful tiles, beautiful vases and pieces with gorgeous glazes, but they contain within them a whole narrative story of a people and their history and their survival. These are all the result of the movement of these artistic works is the result of human conflict and forced migration, as well as individual agency and perseverance under an incredible amount of historical political tumult, empire, nationalism, colonialism. But yet this art continues to survive and thrive. It evokes the distant past. It was nearly extinguished after genocide and World War, and yet it persists today in Jerusalem and now also in Gyumri. As you see right here, a young woman is shaping something on the wheel. This is a transformed branch of an old Ottoman tradition, and for me, it's an emblem of Armenian resilience and survival. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Ms. Moughalian on her wonderful presentation. Now we're going to move to the questions phase. We've prepared a series of questions for Ms. Moughalian. First one. Presumably you knew about the Armenian genocide generally growing up as an Armenian. How did discovering and researching your grandfather's story change your perception or understanding of the Armenian genocide?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. Now, yes, I did know about the Armenian genocide, but I will say that when I started in this whole project, I asked my family members, I said, tell me, because I have a lot of cousins, I have 14 first cousins. I said, tell me everything you know about the Armenian genocide. And they said, well, it started April 24th and 1.5 million people were killed. And I said, tell me everything else that you know about the Armenian genocide. And, you know, that was, I mean, I would say that I knew a little bit more than that, but I didn't know a lot more than that. So it really involved a good 5 years in the library, just like reading everything I could to understand all the processes that were involved and the different theories, because, you know, people have different theories. And then once I had a sort of sense about the Armenian genocide and the First World War, then I had to kind of narrow in on the Western regions and the processes in the Western regions. And those are actually like written about less than the processes in the East. So researching my grandfather's story, it forced me to learn more sort of historical granular detail. But I will also say that the biggest thing was that I didn't realize the extent to which I had inherited generational trauma. I mean, I didn't understand the extent to which the nightmares that I had, the panic attacks that I had, the irrational fears that I had, the chronic depression, sometimes suicidal thoughts. I didn't really, I wasn't connecting. And it wasn't until like I immersed myself in this history and reconstructed, began reconstructing through documents and family interviews, really the horror of what they had endured, the horror of what my grandparents had endured. And of course, as is the case in so many families, the ones who survive, their job is just to survive, to take care of their families, to reestablish themselves. I mean, even that is overwhelming. So, I mean, I do write in the book about the depression that ran through my family, but I will say that coming to really understand it on a more granular level was really healing in the end. Just to have a sense of the horror of the experience and to never want anyone to go through that again.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Actually, I should move to. You touched a lot on our fourth question, which I guess I'll ask now if you want to elaborate at all. Since you talked about trauma, what is it like being a descendant of people who faced a genocide only 2 generations ago? What impact do you think that's had on you? You touched on it a bit already, especially since you explored the story of your grandfather.
Yeah, well, I mean, the happy part of it is I think he inspired me to be a musician, which is what my life's work has been. And although my parents were very against the idea, on some level I thought, hey, if my grandfather could be an artist, why can't I, So it was good because it was the push. But just psychologically, my mother carried the secret of her father's forced conversion until the very, very end of her life. And we had no idea why she would, get so angry sometimes, or, why she would be so depressed. Sometimes she suffered from disease, like various autoimmune diseases for the last 15 years of her life. I mean, she had all the classic symptoms of, somebody who was carrying generational trauma, and she had her own because she became a stateless Palestinian in 1948 as a very young person. So it was hard. It was really hard, but it was really, really healing, because I think the only thing that one can do is try to bring these stories into the light of day, try to share them. By sharing the story of my grandfather's forced conversion, I have had a lot of people write to me or call and just say, this happened in my family too. I've never been able to talk about it. So it was like the disinfecting light of day, and it required grieving properly, for things that deserved to be grieved. But in the end, it was very, very healing to put together a coherent narrative of my grandparents' lives, of my grandfather's accomplishments, of the fact that these 2 schools of ceramic making were connected because of the Armenian Genocide. To publish that, to state it, was very empowering.
For our next question, we want to ask, why did you write this book, and what impact do you hope that this book will have?
Well, I hope I answered that first half of the question a little bit, to fill in the gaps and to create my own coherent narrative of my family's history. What impact did well, I hope that I hoped that it would correct the art historical record, which it seems to be doing, because I notice everybody's spelling his name correctly now. And, I think, it's bringing attention to this Armenian art form. It is naming the Armenian art form as an Armenian art form. So, rather than saying, oh, it's, Kütahya was a Turkish art form. I mean, nobody can really deny that there were Armenians at the core of this art through the whole thing. So, and at the same time, I'm not saying, oh, this was exclusively an Armenian art. This is an Armenian art, and also a Turkish art in the Ottoman Empire, at a time when people were working cooperatively and doing commissions cooperatively. So I hope it will inject some more nuance into the story of this art and into the story of this just very small period of time in this one single family. And I also hope that it will encourage other people who have any inclination whatsoever to research their own family's histories to do so.
And then our next question was that, is there value in comparing your grandfather's experience and the experience of the Armenian genocide more broadly to that of other genocides?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, it's hard to avoid thinking about it. And especially like when you immerse yourself in genocide literature, it's hard not to look at the world around you and, you know, and see all the similarities. So I think, you know, these are human experiences, and unfortunately they happen all too often. So I think there's great value in linking and comparing the experiences and trying to understand what some of the reasons are, and also to watch the world today to see, you know, what tendencies are happening now that were happening, you know, at the rise of the Young Turks. What kind of demonization? I mean, even, it's funny how even some of the vocabulary, the demonizing vocabulary has been repeated over the last few years. So yeah, I think it's tremendously valuable to look for parallels in history.
And one final question, and then we'll move to audience questions. What was the most unexpected challenge you faced in writing your book? Conversely, was there something you anticipated as it being a challenge in writing your book that turned out to not be a problem?
Well, it was really hard to find an Ottoman historian research assistant who was willing to go with me to the Ottoman archives to search for my family's experience of genocide. I mean, fortunately, I could legitimately say that I was also researching Kütahya ceramics, and it's a period in that art history that's very lightly researched. So there's reason for it. And oh, by the way, the book is being translated into Turkish and it'll be published, I think, next year. So I'm very, very happy about that. I think just, you know, pulling together all the details of the story. I had to travel so many places searching for his works. I had a list of his works, but of course the names change. I mean, anybody who works in this history knows the problem of names changing makes it hard to track things down. One thing that turned out to be like a real boon was social media. I mean, there were a couple of things that I just, like in Beirut, for this mosque that he tiled in Beirut, I had run into all these dead ends. And then somebody I met on Instagram connected me to an informal historian of Beirut mosques on Facebook. And that person actually went, he's a pharmacist by day and a mosque historian by night. And so he went to the Waqf in Beirut and got documents about the history of this mosque and how it was bombed and who the architects were and everything. So, I mean, you know, that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago even. So social media was actually extraordinarily valuable in connecting me with other people who had access to tiny bits of information that were necessary.
So now we have our audience portion. If you'd like to ask a question, you could raise your hand and we can call on you, or you could just type your question in the chat and we can say it for you. Maria.
Thank you so much for the very interesting lecture. We all really appreciate it very much. So I know you mentioned like the first steps that you took in, you know, researching your family history, just staying in the library, reading as much as you could. I'm actually looking to research into my own family because my family was from the region. I only know like one town that my great-grandmother was from. She was from Tokat. And
another ceramic producing center.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Small world.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just curious to know if you could elaborate like a little bit more on like the first preliminary steps you took, like the initial steps you took in researching your family history.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I was very lucky because, as I said, toward the end of my mother's life, she wrote down all the family stories. Then her older sister, who was a linguist, an applied linguist, she was like the scholar of the family. She had kept together all these documents. I mean, whatever documents there were, she had them. They were in a box. They were hidden for like 20 years in my cousin's garage in Los Angeles until I started bugging everyone. So a couple different things. First, you can figure out who are all of your living relatives and start writing to all of them and asking them to search their attics, their closets, their photo albums, their boxes of letters, postcards, because all of that contains information, and it contains like more information than you would think. Then there are lots of sources like Hushamadyan. Are you familiar with Hushamadyan?
Somewhat. I think
So
I've heard of the name.
it's a project that comes out of Berlin. Dr. Vahid Tashjan, who's the historian who had worked a lot with Raymond Kevorkian. The project is to reconstruct Armenian village and town life in the Ottoman Empire. And they've been doing a fantastic job of going place by place. The website is Hushamad, M-A-D-Y-A-N. And I highly recommend it. Look for your ancestors' place of origin. Then let's see, Salpi Ghazaryan at University of Southern California. You probably all know her, right? She developed this questionnaire it's called My Armenian Story. If you just Google like USC hashtag My Armenian Story, this 3-page questionnaire will come up. It can be adapted for like any ethnicity or whatever. It kind of walks you through the steps of how to interview members of your family and how to encourage the retrieval of memory. Then you record it. So, I mean, those are like really, really basic things. Ancestry.com is an extraordinarily rich site because they also have the newspapers.com in it. You can find, I mean, like tens of thousands of different digitized newspapers that might relate to what you're talking about, WorldCat, Google Scholar, Google Books. Any kind of aggregating site is really useful to just look for every alternate spelling of every place that your ancestors came from. What else? Those are, I think, good starting points. Does that sound helpful, or am I going in the wrong direction?
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I really appreciate it. Yeah, that's my only question. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, can I ask a question? So is Maria the only one who's interested in her own family history, or are others of you interested in your family histories, or interested in more than you do?
Oh, actually, yeah, I am too. My grandpa actually experienced the genocide when he was 13 years old. So he was from Sart. Like, do you know where that is?
How do you spell that?
It's Siirt. It was an Arab speaking region too. Yeah. And I know they didn't keep a lot of records, and like there's not a lot of, they weren't really good at storytelling. So there's a lot for me to find out. So,
but there's actually like, I was only scratching the surface before on places to look. There's so much. Once you get started, for example, on Facebook, there's an Armenian genealogy group, which has 12,000, 13,000 members. I mean, huge number. And some of these people are like scholars with very, very, very specific interests who, out of their own altruism, like help people decode inscriptions on the back of photographs or direct them toward an archive that might be helpful to them. One of these people has this Armenian immigration project where he has transcribed all the Armenian names from all the ships that have come like from 1850 or whatever to the US. And you can sort by name. or you sort by port of origin, you can sort by town of origin, and there are archives just like all over the place. It's amazing. There's an archive in Marseille that I visited because Marseille was like a huge landing place for Armenian refugees who were going to resettle in Europe. They would land in Marseille. And there are 8 Armenian churches in Marseille, I mean, even today. So they have an archive, and they part of it is digitized. A lot of these archives are being digitized. And then of course, in Armenia, some of the libraries are going through massive digitization projects, like the Armenian National Library is digitizing a lot of material. So it's always worth like checking in. And if you don't find anything, check in again 6 months later, because it's a work in progress. I mean, the Nubar Library in Paris went from only having, these dog-eared index cards as a card catalog to now also digitizing materials. So it's happening very quickly.
I should say one thing. We haven't announced it yet, but the Armenian Students Association is going to host this genealogy expert, George Arjan, at the end of next week for a basic tutorial on how to research your roots. Like it's a very big topic, so obviously you can't cover it all in one lecture, but he's going to give like at least one lecture on that subject, covering a lot of what you said.
He's fantastic. Yeah, he's fantastic.
So whoever's interested will have more information soon on that subject.
Yeah, I was lucky because, there was a trail of ceramic works for me to follow. So there was like, material trail, literally. But I never expected that I would actually find my grandfather's deportation records in the Ottoman archives. There was a folder of his deportation records there because he was forcibly converted and because he had another name. The archives, but without knowing all the pieces, it wouldn't have been possible to do it. So I would say perseverance is like the most important thing. You're going to be amazed at what you're going to find.
I had a question. By the way, amazing presentation. That was really beautiful. But
thank you.
Was there ever like a language barrier? Because I know, so my great grandparents lived in Turkey, and then they fled and moved to like northern Iraq, and that's when like generations passed on. But I could never really communicate with my grandparents that well because they speak Arabic, and my Arabic's like so and so, And I was wondering if that was like, was that a problem for you, or?
Yeah, I had to actually hire a lot of translators. I spent a lot of my savings on hiring translators. But once you start, like you can't. And now Armenian was my first language, but I don't speak it very well. So I'm studying it like 3 mornings a week. My teacher's in Armenia, 8 a.m. I have my half-hour lesson Monday, Wednesday, Saturday.
Nice.
But yeah, it's a problem, but that's not an insurmountable problem, right?
Mm-hmm. I agree with
that. Do you have records from your great-grandparents? Letters?
No, I mean, honestly, like they don't really talk about it that much. I feel like I don't know. It's not really like something we would talk about. I just got this information from my dad, and my dad would always tell me, but my grandpa would tell me a little bit about it. That's when I was young. He passed away when I was pretty young, so it's kind of hard to get information out.
Look at Salpi Ghazaryan's the My Armenian Story thing, because she kind of goes through, in a way like an anthropologist would do it. Also at USC, there's the whole Shoah visual archive that has interviews that were done in like the 1950s and 60s of Armenian genocide survivors. And you can see the kinds of questions that there are techniques for conducting interviews that some are more successful than others. You don't have to actually reinvent the wheel to get your parents to retrieve their memories, but there are ways of doing that might prove to be more productive than other ways. So I would encourage you to read something about, read some cultural anthropologists, start with Salpi's document and go from there, because your father probably has a lot of information stored in his memory and it has to be gently coaxed, and there's a way of doing it, and you're the perfect person to do it.
I agree with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.
I have a question.
Oops.
We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I heard that you said that you're translating the book into Turkish, and I'm assuming that's for the Turkish market. Is that correct?
Artists, publishers, they're translating it into Turkish and
Oh, okay.
publishing it in Turkey. Yeah. I mean, they approached me to do it because they published Armenian interest subjects and translate them into Turkish.
Oh, okay. And so your book is being translated into Turkish.
Mhm.
Okay. And how do you think the Turkish market would take that? Because I know they sensitize a lot of things, and I know that your book mentions the genocide. So do you think that's going to give you any challenges that you have to face, or?
Well, that's a really good question. And, that thought, it did occur to me. They certainly publish things that have to do with the genocide. But here's the thing. My book also is a little bit different from some other writings about Kütahya, in that, like, some art historians have said, oh, Kütahya was just Armenian. I don't say that. Like, I went back and I found, like, trade documents and, like, all kinds of documents. And I write about the Turkish ceramicists, and some of those people, descendants. I mean, I went to Kütahya, I interviewed them. Some of them, like, stayed in touch with me. Some of them retweet my things, because it's also bringing attention to an art form about which, Turks and the Ottoman predecessors had a great deal of pride. So what I tried to do is not be polemical, but just try to stay as close to, like, the actual archival material that I could find, and, tell stories in human terms rather than political ones. So I'm hoping that it'll be, well received. But you're totally right, because I was there in 2014, and Kütahya is very conservative. I met some people who, they gave me a press conference like the day I arrived or whatever. And so I met a bunch of people there. And one of them, who was this retired teacher, friended me on Facebook. We had perfectly fine communications, but the day that I announced that I was doing a concert, in commemoration of April 24th, he scrawled all over my Facebook page, the genocide is a lie, it's a lie. And like, everybody who clicked that they were going to attend the concert, he sent them, direct messages. And there's nothing I can do about that. All I can do is tell this story that I worked very, very hard to tell accurately. So you're right. I mean, it's a constant struggle, but I think that's part of the value of telling stories on the individual level or on the family level, is that I'm not asserting a big political position. I'm saying this was the experience of my family, and it's hard for people to deny that.